honored. This is such a great group. Awesome place. You know, I think most of us here are kind of sick of the elections, and I apologize that I'm going to inflict a little bit of talk about the elections on all of you, given this sickness. I think that it's not just kind of sick, it's perverse. You know, here we have hundreds of millions of Americans all living under the same president, which I think itself is kind of perverse. And this is an office that supposedly we assume is in charge of foreign policy, deciding which countries can trade with which other countries, deciding which people to bomb, deciding which laws to enforce, determining the direction of domestic policy. This is a person, this office, where we expect them to be an expert on health care, on monetary affairs, on trade, on the history of the Middle East. And somehow it seems, especially right before an election, and in the United States, I guess that means 3 years before the election, everyone actually starts to fall for this, that the president is this kind of superhuman person. And Americans start to believe the president is some extension of their will. And the rest of the time that we live in the United States, you know, we know what American life is all about. It's about American culture. It's about going down the street and getting a cup of coffee. It's about trading with people from all over the world and with different religions and different views and with different backgrounds and different lifestyles. And normally, we live relatively harmoniously with one another. And then every 4 years, the country becomes divided over who should be the master overlord of the planet. And the tensions get higher, and we all come to associate ourselves with which member of the ruling class should rule. And I think this is true even of a lot of libertarians, even a lot of radicals. We see ourselves in terms of the presidency somewhat. We can't help but stare. I know on Tuesday night I'm going to be watching the returns like it's a masochist. Right? Because no matter what happens, I'm going to be very upset. And I know that going into it. There's no doubt about it. No matter what happens, I'm going to at that moment think that the worst possibility is what happened. Right? So that's how I'm going into it, and I'm still going to do it. You know, I came of age in a very different time for most of you. I'm starting to get to the point where I can talk to college-age people as though they're significantly younger in any sense. And there is a sense, I mean, half a generation. It's not very long, but back when I was in high school, we didn't have the internet. We had to use CD-ROMs like we did back in the day. But I came of age politically during Clinton. And when I came to Berkeley to go to college and study history, I was in the class of 2003, so I came here in '99. It took me 4 years. So quite an honor. I came in 1999. all I knew, I was a libertarian, but God did I hate liberals, and I hated Bill Clinton, and I hated what he had done. And I thought I couldn't imagine a bigger government supporter than that. I thought this has got to be the worst president, and you know, I would put out literature talking about how he was one of the worst presidents in American history. And of course, that's what I knew. I knew this is the guy whose FBI burned to death almost 80 civilians in Texas in 1993, right? This is the guy who expanded NATO after the Cold War to bomb Serbia, to destroy media centers, hospitals in this war over Kosovo. This is the guy who engaged in multiple military operations, who bombed Iraq all the time. You know, he tried to nationalize healthcare, more or less. He was awful. It was everything I hated about the state. This was the president, and I had a lot of hope despite this. The reason I had hope was because he seemed largely discredited, and although I thought he was so awful, it seemed clear to me he couldn't get away with everything he wanted to do. after the Republicans had won in '94, there seemed to be some gridlock going on. And it just seemed that even on the left, people weren't that crazy about him. And then 2000 came, and George W. Bush won, and he won on this platform of a more humble foreign policy, of privatizing Social Security, cutting taxes. And on some other issues, he sounded good too. He actually at one point said he would end the medical marijuana raids. Very few people remember this, but in 1999 on the campaign trail, he said they were a violation of states' rights. These raids that Clinton had started. So there were a lot of reasons to think Bush might be less bad than Gore. And after a wondrously, just acrimonious week or so, after the hanging chads, there was this, when we couldn't figure out who the president was going to be, it was the Libertarian had waking up and not knowing and seeing how every statist, left and right, just hated this. Oh, this is awful. It was a dream, in fact. If only we could go on forever without it. But then he took over, and actually, briefly, there were reasons to think things might not be all awful. I mean, one of Bush's proposals was to liberalize immigration. That was another thing. And then, of course, and this is the event that's kind of, it's my event. I'm going to grow up, and hopefully I'm going to grow up, and one day I'm going to be an old man, and I'm going to talk about this the way a lot of old people today talk about the Kennedy assassination, or something even longer ago. It was 9/11 now. It was the very clear memory of waking up and watching the news and watching Fox News that night and seeing, these conservatives, they never really got the peace issue, did they? And then it was just one reminder after another that war is the health of the state, right? The nationalization of airport security, the Patriot Act, two major wars, this huge war of aggression in Iraq, which I still think is the worst thing the government's done in my lifetime. Completely awful. I mean, I could probably just spend the hour talking about how awful that is, but I do want this to end on an optimistic note, so I won't. And of course, meanwhile, Bush was quite a disaster of domestic policy, too. He was No Child Left Behind, Medicare D, which was the largest expansion of the entitlement state since the Great Society, doubled the Department of Education, steel tariffs, farm subsidies, widening the war on marijuana to include marijuana paraphernalia. It was crazy, the Bush years. It was like a nightmare. It made me want to, miss Clinton, who I remember very distinctly not liking at all. And so, of course, to make a very long, painful story short, eventually Clinton ran out of time, according to the Constitution. There's about three parts of the Constitution that are still followed, and one of them has to do with how long you can be president. And so, in 2008, Obama, his rhetoric on a handful of the most important issues was so clearly better than McCain's. Now, I've never voted for a Democrat, but I rooted for him as far as it went until he won, and then I thought, oh no, he actually won. Oh, now what's he going to do? But he talked about habeas corpus, which is a de-addition detention policy, surveillance. Patriot Act, he called it shot or dangerous. He was always against the Iraq War, although as senator he kept voting to fund it. And then what we've just had, I once described the Obama administration as like having Clinton and Bush at the same time. Because, first of all, on the issues that have been dearest to me, like these war-related issues, here's a guy who's actually, forget Iraq for a second, forget that he actually tried to stay there longer than Bush agreed the U.S. would stay there. On Afghanistan, he's trying to take credit, and he's getting credit for wanting to wind this thing down by 2014. Now, meanwhile, they're actually talking about extending the troops beyond 2014. But 2014, this war started in 2001. When Obama took power, there were 33,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. And he upped it to 100,000. And then he's phasing it down, and the plan, if they go beyond 2014, is to keep 25,000 troops there, which is about 3/4 as many as the 33,000 that were there when he started. So I mean, picture this. If he wins re-election, we're talking about 8 years to wind down a war by rationing it way up and then cutting it down to a little bit less than it was when he took over. And that's the peace position on Afghanistan, our longest war. And then, of course, in civil liberties, in a sense, I think he's even worse. We've got this detention policy, Guantanamo, which Obama said he would close. And right now, every progressive out there is either disingenuously or out of just sheer partisan blindness, acting like Obama can't close it. They're saying, well, he's just the president. So let me get this straight. Barack Obama, if he wants, he could call someone into his Oval Office, nice office, and say, there's terrorists over here in Pakistan, and I think we should drop a tactical nuke. And chances are it'll happen, right? Because he's the president. But he can't close Guantanamo by just saying, hey, move them, or let's let most of them go. And in fact, this whole defense of Obama misses the main point here, which is that there are over 55 people in Guantanamo who've been cleared for release for years. Some of them have been cleared for over 2 years by his administration, by his task force, by federal courts. But then these releases get appealed, and then they side with the administration as the administration blocks the release. Now, these are people the administration admits are no threat, but in most cases they can't be released because they're Yemeni. And after the underwear bombing didn't happen, Obama decided to take it out on the poor Yemenis who were in Guantanamo and say, we're not going to send people back there anymore. Now, I'm a solid libertarian, as anyone who knows me will attest, but I think that if there's one expenditure I can support, it's that you take all these innocent people in Guantanamo, you buy them nice homes somewhere in Northern Virginia, and you make Dick Cheney pay for it or something. And Obama while you're at it, right? So on detention policy, we have this prolonged detention of people. I mean, picture being told you're going to be free, and then years go by. And one guy, Adnan Latif, was found dead in his cell at Guantanamo in September. And he was the third person in a row to leave Guantanamo dead. The last 3 people who left Guantanamo left dead because Obama has basically stopped the releases. And then he signs the NDAA saying the president can detain citizens indefinitely without cause. And then he claims this power to kill anybody on the planet. This kill list that he has. And Eric Holder, this progressive attorney general, articulates the legal reasoning. And the legal reasoning is, it's due process. Obama thinks this through before he can. That's essentially the gravamen, if you will, of the argument. It really is. It's, he deliberates it. Just because a judge isn't involved doesn't mean it's not due process. I mean, this is Alice in Wonderland, law and order, writ large, gone crazy. And meanwhile, there's all these other civil liberties issues that are not always seen in the fold of the war on terror, though they've been exacerbated. The militarization of the police. Raleigh has shown in his work that we now have 100 SWAT raids every day in this country. Virtually none of them are legitimate. And by virtually, I mean none, but I'll be moderate and say virtually none. Because really, what's a SWAT raid? Well, when you grow up watching TV, a SWAT raid is, there's a terrorist. Maybe he's Russian because you're watching some movie before 1989. And there's some terrorist, and you gotta, rush in there and stop him before he kills someone, so you get the SWAT team. Now, when it's actually dangerous, SWAT team often doesn't go in. Because it's dangerous. That's what happened in Columbine. They said, we can't go in there, we're going to get shot. So what they actually do with a SWAT team is they say, it's 3 a.m. Yeah, even they're probably asleep, though they have a marijuana grow. Let's break down the door, kill their dogs, and if they're lucky, they'll come out alive. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. This is happening every day. And when I was born, 31 years ago, give or take. There was a tenth as many SWAT raids, and that was too many too, but that's just one idea of what's been ramped up. And under Obama, specifically, some civil liberties issues have gotten notably worse, and there's not much discussion about it. Like immigration. The deportations have escalated under Obama. And again, they'll say, well, he can't stop us. Well, he modified them with his executive order this year to make certain exceptions. So he can't tell them to just stop deporting so many people. He's about double the rate that was existing under Bush. And then there's the medical marijuana crackdowns, which Obama explicitly promised he'd stop, including after he became president. And there have been about 4 times as many raids in the last 4 years as there were in 8 years of Bush. So that means 8 times as many raids per year. And this is the Obama drug war. And of course, what happens under a Democrat is the civil libertarian left becomes marginalized. It still exists, but it becomes marginalized on the left. And many progressives who use that rhetoric all the time, Bush is a war criminal, Bush is violating the Constitution, Bush is killing the Bill of Rights. They just kind of forget about all that. And there's a sense in which Obama's been worse on civil liberties, not just substantively, but in terms of discourse. In fact, all the polls bear this out. If you look at polls during the Bush administration and how many Americans support torture and indefinite detention, it's all gotten much worse under Obama. Because if even a liberal Democrat, a constitutional law professor is okay with chaining someone up without cause forever, then why isn't it, proper policy? So that's pretty awful. But then there's also, his economic policy, right? I mean, even if that was all we were looking at, I think he's a guy who should be fired. And if I believed in, if I was a big guy for government justice, I'd say try, but I have issues with that. But certainly at the minimum, fire, impeach, right? But then there's his economic policies. Now, I don't know if Hayek was clairvoyant, but I have a hard time believing that he even knew what the pretense of knowledge was, not having looked at the Obama administration. I mean, there's not a single area where they don't think infinite government power is the direction to go, right? I mean, and just the extent of economic ignorance that underlies these policies. The top 100, if I were to list the top 100 things I hated about the Obama administration, cash for clunkers wouldn't make the list, because it's not one of the worst 100 things he's done. But if anything sums up just the pure intellectual bankruptcy that we're confronted in the area of economics, it's this. You don't have to have read Keynes and then read Hazlitt's critique of Keynes and then gone back to Samuelson and then read the latest Necessians. You just have to understand that destroying cars that work isn't good, right? I mean, that's just that's basic to me, that if that car works, don't just destroy it, right? Well, this was, of course, a pretty minor thing. It was just a few years ago. But I remember when Obama and the FDA under Obama, prohibited flavored cigarettes, and I was a cigarette smoker at the time. And it's just obnoxious, because if you're gonna drag us down through Keynesian hell and keep unemployment high while you try to stimulate the economy, at least let me smoke something vanilla flavored. But no, they just, every single area they've just targeted. And so this is what we're really looking at. This is, when we're thinking of what 4 more years of Obama would mean, we can look back at this. I didn't even mention Dodd-Frank or Obamacare, but those alone are just so horrifying. I don't even like to think about them. I like to pretend they don't exist and only focus on the kill list. That's bad enough. But that's what we're looking at. But then when we look at, what the alternative is. Now, putting aside the fact that Romney seems to take every position on every issue, and so maybe by chance he'll end up being an anarcho-capitalist. I don't know. I think that the most worrisome single thing about all this is the conservatives and the Republicans were never properly enough repudiated on the issue of war. I mean, Obama's victory over McCain was a good thing in that sense, except it didn't really seem to stick. If you look at the entire right side of the spectrum, I mean, Romney's, if you look at his foreign policy advisors, they're about 2/3 Bush holdovers. A number of them were part of the project of the New American Century. And these were the guys who said in the late 90s, we need a new Pearl Harbor so then we can launch a global crusade. You know, these are the architects of the Iraq War. This massively devastating act of horror and aggression and you know, all of the torture chambers and the devastation of the Bush administration totally destroyed huge parts of that country, set it back in so many ways, and these people were the architects. And the problem is, even if Romney didn't, I don't think he's an ideologue. I don't think he necessarily believes in the neocon Trotskyite dream of perpetual revolution through the Pentagon. But even if he wanted to just have realists, like the guys who were only bad enough to advise the first Bush on the first Iraq War, you know, back when there were wars of aggression, but they were short.
Some restraint.
There was some restraint, yeah. Even if he wanted only people like that, there wouldn't be enough on the right, because they're all neocons that are close enough. So, I mean, I fear that that's the biggest thing that I would fear about a Romney presidency. Now, I don't think any of the other stuff's going to get much better. You know, he even says he's not going to repeal Obamacare now. He's going to keep the parts of, you know, if you keep the parts of the pre-existing conditions, keep the mandate, that's Obamacare. I mean, Obamacare's even worse because there's all this regulation, but really he might ratchet that back a little. Maybe, I'm being very charitable. And, you know, government will probably eventually stop growing as fast as it has been just because of, you know, you can only grow so fast, right? So there's a limit on these things. So, but I am afraid of that war, of another war breaking out. Not that Obama's been a peaceful president, right? Despite the prize. The Kissinger Woodrow Wilson Peace Prize. But, you know, so I should explain why I'm so hopeful. Right? Because I've been said many good things. Many reasons to be hopeful. Well, first of all, one last reason not to be so hopeful in the short term. This actually will bolster the case for hope, paradoxically enough. Even if we had everything we wanted, and let's say Obama came in and was the best, still a liberal, but the best that we could have hoped, which would have been like the greatest thing ever. All he would have had to do was ratchet back some of the national security stuff, and you know, he could have spent some more money on some government nonsense. And could have even raised taxes a couple percent. That would have been awful, but it would have been like one of the best presidents we've ever had. And it would have still been a liberal, right? It would have been much better. But even if we get something like that, or even if Romney came in, or Obama's much better, or 4 years from now, someone comes in and does their best to repudiate the last few years, this government sucked even before Bush. That's what I'm trying to get. Like when I was a libertarian, that was before Bush. You know, we already had the biggest prison population in the world. We already had the largest welfare programs in this unsustainable entitlement state. You know, it's true that the debt is something like $10 trillion bigger now than it was 12 years ago. But if you look at unfunded liabilities, that's almost rounding error. I mean, putting aside the Bush shit with Medicare. But it was horrible before. The FDA was killing thousands of Americans, depriving them life-saving medicine, regulatory agents with guns going roughshod over Americans. Horrible stuff was happening, even before Bush and Obama. And this is why we should hope. Because the short term, there are reasons in the short term even to be hopeful, and I'll get to those, but they're not really the most important point I want to drive home. It's about the long term that I want to talk about now, because I think one of my favorite libertarians, maybe my favorite single libertarian thinker, it's kind of hard, but definitely one of the top influences on me, Marie Rothbard, he said that the conservative has long been marked by this long-term pessimism and this short-term optimism, or this short-term fixation. So the conservative thinks that the long-term case for what the conservative believes should be is kind of lost. Human nature, humans are fallen. The long-term is just going to be taken over by tyrants and communists at the time when Rothbard wrote this. And so everything's all about the short term. The next election, the next war, the next showdown with communism, the next battle. And this is why conservatism is so hopeless, because in fact, in the long term, conservatism is a losing game. In the long term, liberty is the side to be on. For thousands of years, humans have had it far worse than almost anyone here. I don't presume to know. I mean, some of you might have a really unlucky situation, and there are people in this country who are in prison being raped and beaten. I mean, there are a lot of them. There are a lot of people being brutalized. But in general, overall, if you want to look at things in the aggregate, things were far worse. I mean, for millennia, the rule was the rule. The rule was the total state. It was autocracy. It was the Pharaoh who was God. And everyone's, what they did in life was just determined. There was no chance at all. There was no contract. It was all status. You were either a scribe, which wasn't that great, or you had it much worse. Right? And for thousands of years, it was about theocracy, coercive patriarchy. It was about militarism. The vast majority of all government expenditures until the last 100, 200 years were on war and preparing for war. And on the one hand, we libertarians are used to saying, look at all of these other things the state's taken over. And that's true. And there's that's horrible that the states learn to do this. Oh, we're for insurance, we're for schools, we're going to build your roads. Now, they were always involved in some of this. But we sometimes fall in this trap. We say, look, the state's taking over more stuff. On the other hand, more and more of the stuff that the state takes over is stuff that the state knows we value, that civil society can't do without. It calls them its hugest program an insurance program. Before it wasn't, they didn't trick people that way. They just said, we go to war because of honor. We go to war because of glory. You want to serve your king. I am all that matters. You die because I say so. And that was that. And it's true that in the Middle Ages, there was a decentralism and it sometimes overstated how totalitarian it was. And yet, even on the so-called local level, feudalism isn't exactly, it's not a walk in the park. It's serfdom. This was the norm everywhere. And one of the biggest reasons it was the norm was because ideas shape political reality and social reality. If you live in a society where most people think that slavery is fine or that the Pharaoh is God, well, you're stuck with that. If you live in a society where most people think slavery is not okay, and the president of the U.S. says that he's going to bring slavery back, people would just laugh him out of the room. Even the president couldn't get away with some things because ideology's changed. And ideology has changed a lot. And it's been a rocky ride. But you got to consider, this many people in this room, this is how many people believed in liberty in the whole world, a few hundred years ago. And the first movement that had any cohesive libertarian consistency was probably the Levelers in the mid-17th century in England. They hated the king's absolutism and the fact the king would detain people without cause. But then when Parliament took power during the English Civil War, they didn't like that either. It was very consistent, opposing, today's progressives could learn something from these Levelers. They didn't like indefinite detention from either party. But they were very consistent. They came up with theories of religious liberty, freedom of contract. They criticized the radical egalitarianism of the diggers, but opposed autocracy and reactionary government. But they were, a small movement. And then there was, of course, the great classical liberal movement, which in the 18th and 19th century did a lot to animate people in the cause of liberty. But boy, was it flawed, right? I mean, John Locke was kind of weak on slavery, as a lot of classical liberals were, as the so-called founding fathers were. And yet, in the American Revolution, we see so many reasons to be optimistic about ideas. Because, in the short term, the revolution, it deflated the British Empire, which was a great thing. And it brought to power a new ruling class in America, which wasn't so great. But in the long term, as historian Bernard Bailyn, the great historian of the American Revolution, has written about, there was what he called the contagion of liberty. There were these ideas that started to take hold. The first anti-slavery societies, the first serious hearing to the idea of women's rights, that women should be treated, I don't know, like human beings. They're only half of us, maybe they should count for something. And the idea of religious toleration. In fact, not just religious toleration, but religious privatization. The idea that religion should be totally separated from the public sphere. This is not the public sphere, but I should say, but the state. And this was all remarkable. I mean, again, for hundreds of years, and even in the early colonies in America, I mean, people were governed by theocracies. They were tortured to death if they were of the wrong religion. People had to dress the way, there were sumptuary laws that controlled what you were allowed to wear. It was not really freedom. And of course, despite the great ideals that took hold, thanks to the revolution, for the first, half, not quite half of the U.S., but the entire early period in the antebellum era, there was the horror of chattel slavery. On the eve of the Civil War, there were 4 million people enslaved in maybe not the absolute worst, but one of the worst slave systems in world history. And a lot of times libertarians like to think back with nostalgia on the 19th century. Well, now I'll say that the federal government has grown to be really big and invasive, and it's become a menace to the rest of the world. And that wasn't, for the most part, true in the 19th century. But the 19th century, I don't really want to go back to that. I mean, the first half, there's chattel slavery. And I have kind of like philosophical issues against calling that a free society. I mean, chattel slavery wasn't just like, oh, those people aren't free, everyone else is free. No, the whole system was, especially in the South, was just totally perverted by it. The slave power controlled foreign policy. There probably wouldn't have been a war with Mexico if not for the slave power. Poor white Southerners were being conscripted in the slave patrols. The entire federal government was supporting this horrible institution. And then we had Lincoln, and he just unleashed a whirlwind of death and destruction, and over 500,000 Americans died, and he installed something akin to a military dictatorship that lingered during Reconstruction. So we had Reconstruction, we had military tribunals, we had black codes, vagrancy laws, blacks being re-enslaved through vagrancy laws. And then, by the end of the 19th century, things started to look pretty good for a lot of people compared to a lot of other times and places in history. That's true. But still, there were coverture laws, I mean, it's a big deal when like half the people in your society aren't allowed to own property if they get married. I mean, this is a big big deal that we don't even worry about today, because now all our property is the state. No, I'm just kidding. Back to my forceful point. Now, in the early 20th century, I'm going to admit something. I think things went haywire. And one reason was because the liberals, the classical liberals, were never radical enough. They got suckered into supporting the state as a means of liberating the common people against the rich and the powerful. It used to be the people who hated, used to be like if you had Occupy Wall Street in the early 19th century, they'd all be libertarians. In fact, you can see critiques of Wall Street on the basis of class analysis that were libertarian back then. Not even making it up. But what happened is the liberals got all perverted, they got all corrupted by the state, the promise that they could use the state. And of course, the extreme version of this was communism. And in America, it was progressive. And progressivism has a lot to answer for. We're still basically living in the progressive era. But geez, you know, we think this election is tragic. In 1912, it was Wilson, Roosevelt, or Taft. And we know how bad all three of them were because they were all president. They were all awful, just worse than the last one. And then, of course, this corruption in the liberal movement was so dire that a lot of them signed on to the great global crusade of World War I. And World War I was promised it was going to end, you know, tyranny, make the world safe for democracy. Instead, it ushered in communism, fascism, militarism, Nazism, eventually, and in the United States, the consolidated command economy, which was revived during the New Deal. Now, I like to think about the New Deal whenever I'm in a bad mood. First of all, because I hate the New Deal. I think that no libertarian can ever hate the New Deal enough. We should still hate it, that man and everything else. But what I like to think about is, what would it have been like to be a libertarian then? And to be a libertarian then usually meant you were either the classical liberal or you were a progressive who thought even FDR went too far. I mean, keep in mind that FDR won the election in 1932. He ran on a platform of cutting government, protecting the gold standard, free trade, ending prohibition, you know, good neighbor policy. It was the most libertarian major party platform since. It was FDR's in 32. It's why Ayn Rand voted for FDR in 1932. So keep that in mind. Whenever you think a major party politician sounds good, I bet they don't sound as good as FDR did. But in the 30s, if you were like one of us, first of all, there were 7 libertarians in the United States. And, you know, back then there was no internet, so if you wanted to even read with each other, you'd have to like write a letter and say, let me read a copy, and it would take a month, and then, oh, that's what that person thinks of the agricultural adjustment act. It was a bad time to be a libertarian. There were 7 of us. And imagine, you know, I had to live through Clinton getting reelected, Bush getting reelected, maybe I'll see Obama getting reelected. Imagine seeing FDR get reelected. First he gets elected, and then he gets elected again, and then once more he gets elected. Oh, and then he gets elected again. I mean, imagine that. And of course, who replaced him? Truman, the guy who ends one war through acts of nuclear terror, and then starts the Cold War. You know, Obama and Romney and Bush don't seem so bad, do they? I mean, this was just the worst time to have to deal with these ideas of liberty when the entire world seemed to believe in the opposite, all over, including the United States. And of course, in the world, it was communism. I mean, geez, for the lion's share of the 20th century, the number of people who were enslaved by the system, Lenin taking power, butchering millions of people, not thousands, millions. And they didn't have high-tech weaponry. They just did it with what they got, right? And then Stalin's worse. And then Mao, and you know, we just horrible conquest of all of Eastern Europe, practically all of Asia, Latin America, communism everywhere, the stupidest idea anyone ever came up with, and everyone's enamored of it, even though it has the worst record of any idea in practice ever, right? But then it just ends. I mean, it still exists, and in fact, in the Stalinist form in North Korea, it exists, and we should never forget that. But the Soviet Union, the great powerhouse of communism, just collapses because people don't believe in it anymore, because it doesn't work. Peaceful, there are no nuclear showdowns in the late 20th century. There's horrible wars, Vietnam, torching people to death by the millions. But there's no great cataclysm to compare with World War I and II, what some scholars call the hemiclysm put together, all of the 70, 80 90 million people that were murdered in the first half of the 20th century by their states or other states. Nothing compares to that in the second half. And then what else happens? Well, tax rates in the United States, at their height, thanks to FDR, they hit over 90% marginal tax rate. Over 90%. And they've been cut several times since. There are all these other areas where things have actually improved quite a bit, and they're easy to take for granted, like the draft, right? There was the draft for World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Millions of young men forced by gunpoint to go commit homicide on behalf of the state. And this program's ended. Now, I'm not saying that the way it is done now, where soldiers can't quit, I think that's awful. I think they should be allowed to quit. I think it's a form of indentured servitude not to let them quit. But it's still better than the draft. Right? And then we see in all these other areas, tariffs. Used to be pretty fashionable in this country. There were ebbs and flows with protectionism. People really believed in it. Now it's all half-hearted, you can tell. I mean, women. It wasn't that long ago that there were laws in the book shielding husbands from prosecution for raping their wives. I think North Carolina was the last state to repeal this law in '93. Right? I mean, a lot of good has been done. I mean, race relations. We used to have segregation. Now we have the drug war, right? We have awful things going on. But it used to be, if a black guy hit on a white girl or just said hi or was confused for saying hi, he might get murdered, the jury would acquit. It wouldn't be abnormal at all. Now it would be a scandal. And it's a good thing it would be a scandal. How about the fact that not all that long ago, homosexuality was criminalized? Now today, people debate gay marriage and are frustrated at how long that issue's taken. And yet, it wasn't that long ago. A lot of people, several people in this room remember when those laws were not just on the books, but enforced. Right? Gun laws have gotten a little bit more liberal in a few states. And I'd say ideologically, although it's so frustrating because we see this crude Keynesianism. We see Chris Christie persecuting price gougers who are just doing what the market absolutely needs them to do to help people in a hurricane. We see this just total ignorance about foreign cultures and then advocating going to war with them. But then there's a lot of things that we didn't see. We didn't see after 9/11, which was in Manhattan as opposed to on a military base in Pearl Harbor. We didn't see 100,000 people rounded up and interned. Right? We don't see people advocating, well, maybe outside of the radical objectivists. We don't see people advocating nuclear first strike. We certainly don't see, we don't see the same tolerance for mass killing. I really think we've seen some improvement, at least over the last century. It used to be policy that the U.S. would try to kill as many people as it could in certain theaters of war, right? In Vietnam, that was basically the policy. Carpet bombing Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. Probably millions killed in those wars. Even Bush didn't do that. And if he did, people would have a problem with it, I really think. We do see some improvement. And of course, with the end of communism, we see that we won the biggest economic argument there is to win. And we didn't really even need to fire a shot. We just needed to wait until the other side lost on their own because their system is so stupid. It's glorious, and it's still affecting it. You hear Obama, now his heart's not in it, but he talks about the free market. He says, well, we support the free market system. Now, he's saying that because he knows that those words are a positive thing in the minds of swing voters in Ohio. I'm guessing that's his calculation. But that's a great thing. In the 1930s, everyone who's respectable was either a fascist or a socialist, and I'm not exaggerating. That was the dominant ideology, was collectivism of the most radical, dehumanizing sense. Then you see Romney in the debate.
debate, the third debate. He says, we can't kill our way out of this. We don't want another Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, we don't have to believe him to say this is a positive thing, that he has to say that, or that he feels that it helps him. And then we look back again. One of the greatest points a good point that Jeff Hummel, San Jose State, makes is, there was a time in the world when slavery was just seen as part of, reality, right? You can't get rid of it. It's like the way most people see death and taxes now. It's just death, taxes, and slavery, right? And today, there's not a single dictator, Jeff says, dictator, who would come out and just overtly say, I'm for chattel slavery. In the late 18th century, the most libertarian Americans had slaves. Today, dictators couldn't say, we need to protect this. People would say, what are you, some barbarian? We can't just come out and say, no, I'm not saying that what they support isn't as bad. But there has been ideological improvement. And in the short term, there's reasons to be happy, not just because things are moving ideologically, but there are actual developments. You see in the last few years this nullification movement, and it's small, this idea that, well, just because the federal government says it, doesn't mean we're going to do it. And we've seen it in practice, especially with medical marijuana, where the state of California was told by the Supreme Court, no, our laws supersede yours, and California said, all right, we're going to keep doing this. And yeah, the feds can raid California, but without California going along with it, it's going to be tough for the feds to actually do anything. They can't stop it, right? Even though LA, overturned all the dispensaries, they're not going to actually stop it. And then now we have Colorado and Washington thinking of just legalizing it outright. And it's going to keep being on the ballot. It might not even win. The drug warriors come out at the last minute with their same reefer madness crap they come out with all the time. If you let people smoke pot, they'll become genocidal, Islam, fascist, or whatever. But I think people are starting to not believe that anymore. You can only I guess the drug war of that crude propagandistic type can only persist so many decades after the release of Sgt. Pepper before every 70-year-old's I don't know, I never saw anyone go that crazy when I saw it 50 years ago, right? So the drug war, I think, is eventually going to end. Now, I've been saying this for years, and they sure have been pumping it up and keeping it going. But once they can't control that, if Colorado, these states start legalizing it, if the federal government realizes it can't keep this up, then all of a sudden you're going to have these illicit drug statistics look a lot different. They're not going to be able to say, look at how many million Americans use illegal drugs. If marijuana's legal, that number is 5% is big. And then, eventually people are going to start thinking, what else has the government been wrong about? If they actually legalize this stuff, it'd be kind of like Portugal, I think, where eventually things would kind of become better in all possible ways, because the drug war is just terrible in all possible ways. But once that's over, it's going to be like everything else. It's going to be like segregation. It's going to be like coverture laws, where 50 years from now, I'm trying to be very guarded in my optimism, people are going to say, we used to lock people up for smoking plants in this country. and I have faith that in the very long term, you see this in research, James Payne's book, History of Force, Steven Pinker's work recently, that all of these horrible things, this used to be a world where virgin sacrifices were going on every day, feudalism, slavery, mass murder, torture used to be a really common way to deal with people you disagree with theologically. Now, usually, you just say, hey, you want to grab pancakes? Things are... I think in the very long term, things are getting better. So this is what I'll close on how not to give up in the short term, because sometimes you might say, yeah, okay, in 100 years, people will figure out why cash for clunkers was stupid. What about now? Well, this is the way I reason with it. And this is almost an altruistic, strategic approach. I think, hot damn, there's all of this freedom that I have that was denied to most people throughout history. because of people in history who were willing to stand up and say chattel slavery is evil, who were willing to stand up and say, people should be allowed to dress as they want, we shouldn't have a draft. People stood up for this stuff, against alcohol prohibition, all the rest. And so we should fight in the short term, because there are short-term battles that we can win. But there's nothing wrong with having a long-term outlook and feeling like you are getting something in return. But we just already got it. We got it from the people who already fought for liberty. All the women here who can get married and still own their stuff, Cherish that. I'm not trying to minimize that. I keep going back to it because it's a big deal. Just savor what you have, but never lose sight of aggression against anybody. Always stand up for every person's liberty against the state. Everywhere on earth against the freedom against being bombed, taxed, imprisoned without hurting anybody, all of it. Because in a sense, we're already reaping the rewards of past fighters for liberty. And we can just take some solace in that as we fight for a far freer tomorrow. Thanks. Okay, questions?
What do you think about the future of the liberty movement within the Republican Party? We're seeing a really large generation comes to power.
I have a lot of trouble. This is one of the, I'm usually very candid about any question. Okay, so I don't object to any peaceful means that people want to pursue. And to the extent that the Republican Party or the Democrat Party can become less fascist because of the agitation of people within it, that's a good thing. And in fact, that's always been part of the story of liberty, is that even people vying for power, their ideology changes to reflect other things. That's not my approach. I recently commented that, the first time a Republican became president, he suspended habeas corpus, he racked up mountains of debt, and he started a war that killed 500,000 Americans. The last time a Republican became president, he suspended habeas corpus, he racked up mountains of debt, and started a war that killed 500,000 foreigners. But if we work within the Republican Party, we can bring them back to their roots of peace and liberty, just like they were back in no time whatsoever. I really don't think that, whatever approach works, but I don't think that if part of your understanding is that the Republican Party used to have this libertarian core, I don't see it at all. I think that there were Republicans like in the 1920s that weren't as bad as Woodrow Wilson, but that's not our feat to accomplish. Wilson put people in jail for saying he was bad. Wilson was like a tyrant who was tied for the worst president in American history. But even those 1920s Republicans like Warren Harding, the best president of the 20th century, one of the greatest Republican presidents, he was an immigration restrictionist, he was a prohibitionist, he was a protectionist. He was awful. He wasn't anything like us. It's just that he was infinitely better than Woodrow Wilson. And you see this again, Eisenhower, much better than Truman. Well, who's not better than Truman? Mao Zedong, maybe? Well, Eisenhower, he's the one who, here's just one thing that great Republican did. 1953, Iran. Truman had said, no, we can't do that. That's crazy. Eisenhower came in and he did that. And we've been paying the price for 60 years. That's as good as the Republican Party gets. Destroying 60 years of American foreign policy. So, I don't know, there's some people in the Republican Party. I mean, Ron Paul, I think, is a hero of libertarianism and classical liberalism, but not because of the power he wielded, just because he was able to use that political platform educationally. That's my view. I don't think the state is really the answer to the state.
How optimistic are you about the future of just like our generation and child?
Well, again, I think that there's all of these areas where I mean, are we going to see the end of income tax and the total end of this militarized police, which is one of the things that scares me most? No, but I think that there are victories we're going to see in the next couple decades, and some are going to surprise us. Some, I'm surprised often by how short our presidents fall from how bad I expect them to be in whatever. And it's not just about presidents, of course. Gun rights. Obama did, as far as I know, the only things he did on that front were good. Because he knew that he didn't want to tick off those swing voters in Ohio, So, yeah, we're gonna, if you want the whole thing, which I do right now, as much as anyone, I'd push that button. I'd break my finger pushing that button to get rid of all of it, because all of it's bad. But we're not going to get that, and we're not going to get anything close to that. But we're going to have a lot of short-term reasons to keep chugging along. And again, I really think we need to appreciate what we have. It's easy to focus on all of the things we're not allowed to do. But most of us here can go wherever we want. That's a big deal. It didn't used to be like that under feudalism.
Do you think we'll ever break away from this two-party system?
Ever? I mean, let's see. The Earth's 5 billion years old, I think, in my last. No. I mean, in the terms of what you're thinking about, I think the two parties have it rigged. I think they're going to continue having it rigged. It's possible there'd be a really powerful public movement against it, but if that happened, many other even better things could happen.
What's your way forward then, given that we can't count on the Republicans in the two-party system? It's just rigged.
Well, I think that the fundamental, there are two things that are on our side, which are the laws of economics. The state cannot do what it wants to do. Okay? We don't get the government to pay for it, which is great. Thank goodness. And the second thing is ideology, that the state can only oppress insofar as the people put up with it. The state is always a minority ruling class. And the majority has to at least tolerate or acquiesce in what's going on. And I think that means that the key is changing hearts and minds. So I think you should learn as much as you can about liberty, about economics, about history and philosophy, and try to convince people. And I don't think, one thing I didn't hit on, I should hit on real fast is, when I came to Berkeley after 9/11, we got fractured and all this, and there was like 3 of us meeting for weeks. And that was not that long ago. I thought the libertarian movement was dying out because there were more old libertarians than young libertarians. I was on Berkeley's campus. There was we went to go see Harry Brown, and we could only get like 12 people. And I see the photo, and half those people, I don't even know if they were libertarians or we just picked them up randomly and forced them to go. But now it's just, there's so many more young libertarians, and that is a huge, and you don't see what that means, but it does mean something. Every one of you who's a good example, who convinces, people maybe they should question the next war or the next stimulus, this has a ripple effect. This is all that really matters. And it's not very satisfying day to day, but it does make a difference. The fact there's this many people here, Ludwig von Mises would have, killed to see this many people interested in liberty in one place. Let alone this is happening all over. There used to be, I know libertarians who tell me, oh, back in the day, I go to Nebraska. People would say, you know, there's a libertarian there? You should look him up, Joe. Oh, there's a libertarian there. And, you know, people would go out of their way and they'd all hang out in Rothbard's apartment or Ayn Rand's, you know, studio, and there'd be like 6 of them. And they, you know, and half of them got the draft wrong. Right? No, I'm serious. And now, most libertarians don't know each other. Most of them are not. A lot of older libertarians tell me, oh, I hope now because you're young. I'm like, you don't even know. I'm older than the median libertarian, I think. And it's so awesome. And there's all these groups, they don't even know each other. I bumped into this guy at In-N-Out, and he had this Ron Paul shirt. And I said, nice shirt. Now, way back in the 1990s, if I had bumped into someone with a libertarianish shirt, and I said, hey, you believe in freedom, we would have struck up a conversation lasting hours, because this was our one chance to talk to each other. That was the thing. Now, this guy didn't know. He's like, he probably thought, oh, it's just another Ron Paul, yeah, okay, whatever. He didn't even want to wave. Like, he's complimented on that shirt 100 times that day.